you who don't know me, I think everyone does, but I'm Wendy Welch, and I'm very excited to have Jessica do a talk tonight. It's a talk she did a version of in Zane's Language of Abstraction class, and everyone thought it was such a great talk, and Zane really encouraged me to have it, open to the public. And it's something I've been thinking about for a while, the idea of maybe just having talks on different contemporary art topics. So someone's not necessarily taking an art history course or critical studies course, but they're interested in some of the ideas that are involved in contemporary art. So we'll hope that this will be the first of many talks by Jessica and other people. So Jessica is a student here. She's in her third year in the Diploma of Fine Arts program, and she did a BA in art history at McGill and University of Victoria, and she graduated in 2010. So you came to visa after university. So, and she's really a wonderful example of someone who's interested in the practice of visual art, but also critical thinking and critical theory. And you see a lot of artists really interested in those both kind of roles, whether artists become critics or art historians or curators. It's really just makes life much more exciting if you kind of embrace all sides of the art making practice. So before I let Jessica speak, I just want to remind people of some upcoming talks, because we have quite a good range of talks, and our talks are able to happen because of great people in the visa community who donated money to cover the talks. I know some of you might know we didn't get our BC Arts Council grant for artist talks this year, so I put out a call in the newsletter and many people came forward, so it's been really great. I've been trying to line up some different people from the community, but also from Vancouver. We have some artists coming from Vancouver. So next week we have Rick Leon on Wednesday, November 13th at 7:30, and he's an instructor here. So if you want to know more about his work, or you're thinking about taking one of his classes, he's a really good chance to see his work. And then the following week we have a professor from the University of Gloucester, Jack Southern, and he's going to talk about the university. If anyone's interested in going there, want to know about their fine art program, he's going to talk all about that. And he's a really interesting artist, and he published one of my all-time favorite drawing books called Drawing Project. So I was really excited to make the connection. It was my favorite book before having this, we have an articulation agreement with the University of Gloucester, so people could do their Bachelor of Fine Arts, their Diploma of Fine Arts, and transfer it to the University of Gloucester and get a BFA in 1 year. So he's going to be coming and talking all about the school. That's in the afternoon, and it'll be in the newsletter. That's at 1 o'clock on Tuesday. And then Barry Ziakin is going to be talking Thursday, November 28th at 7:30. So he's a local artist who's been working really dedicated for many years, and he's going to be teaching a class. He taught many years ago at the Victoria College of Art, and he's always wanted to come back to teaching. So I thought it's nice if artists and our students get to see the work of the teachers, and they might be inspired to take one of his classes. He's teaching a class in January called Nature as Source, Painting Nature as Source. And one of the things I love about Barry's practice is that he has this kind of routine where he goes for a walk every day with his dog and picks up one item from nature and incorporates it in his painting. So it's a really quiet, meditative way of working, but really quite interesting. So he's going to talk about that. And then in December, on December 11th, we have Ben Van Netten, who's a Victoria artist. Some people might know of him. He lives half the time in Berlin and half the time in Victoria. So he's in Victoria for December, so I was able to get him to give a talk on December 11th at 7:30. So those are, stay tuned. I don't expect you to remember all the dates, but I'm hoping this will inspire you to think about, I've got to check the newsletter, see when the next talk is, because we have one almost every week until the next semester. And then the next semester is extremely exciting, but I'm not going to tell you that. But I've got some great artists from Vancouver coming over. So, and then if anyone would like to donate like $5, $10, there's a donation container in the back, just so that we can continue inviting artists, especially if we're inviting artists from further away. It's nice to be able to pay for their accommodations and just get to hear artists we wouldn't normally get to hear in Victoria. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jessica.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. This talk is designed to be 1 hour long, and it was 1 hour long in Zane's class, including discussion and intervention from the audience. So please feel free to yell out a question or ask me to repeat things, to linger over an idea or an image, and also please don't hesitate to ask me to speak up. I know how frustrating that can be. I'm handing out a copy of what you see in front of you, as well as a list of artists that we're going to be talking about. I only made 30 copies, so there might not be quite enough to go around, but let me know afterwards if you would like a copy. And I just wanted to spend a few minutes on this. You'll have had time to have looked at it and maybe form some opinions or some questions. I wanted to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page when we talk about contemporary abstract painting. And the first thing to address is the word contemporary. We all know the word contemporary in the sense of a lowercase c contemporary, that Einstein was a contemporary of, FDR or Hoover. We also can think about contemporary art then as just work that's done right now, or artists that are contemporary to one another, like Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein. But what we mean when we say capital C contemporary abstract painting, or capital C contemporary art, in a very simple definition, be work that's made and responding to the world these days. So work that's made in the last 20, 30 years, and work that's responding to the world of the last 20 or 30 years. So just because you painted a vase of flowers yesterday doesn't necessarily mean it's contemporary art, because it may or may not be responding to kind of the history of painting and how we think about a vase of flowers in the 21st century. Now, the reason that I jumped into modernism and postmodernism is that these are kind of the threads of theory that feed into contemporary painting and contemporary thought. So I wouldn't say that postmodernism is synonymous with contemporary art, but it is kind of a foundation in thought. And I know that postmodernism can make people nervous. And so the next thing I would say is that modernism and postmodernism they can be thought about in two ways, and they exist in two ways simultaneously. One is that they can be a philosophical stance or a political stance that you take and you say, I'm a modernist. I'm optimistic about what technology can do for us. I think that humanity and society is progressing, that artists are heroic individuals, and when I make art, I'm going to make a point. Or you can say, I'm a postmodernist. I believe the author is dead. I believe that everything modernism promised is bupkis, and it's all going to hell in a handbasket, and I want to critique that. And I'm not going to say, I don't believe that we can appeal to any overarching meaning, system of meanings, so I just get to do what I get to do, and you're up a creek if you don't understand what I'm doing, because it's my voice and it's my language. And I'm going to raise questions about the world. I'm not going to make a point, I'm going to raise questions. The other way that these two categories exist as just descriptions of the world we live in, or lived in. So there was also the modern world, and there's also the postmodern world. And those are lowercase modern and lowercase postmodern. So this might upset some people, but I would say that to some degree, almost anyone working right now is a postmodern artist. That's just the way things go. We have we're post 9/11, we're post financial meltdown. It's really hard to have any illusions about some of the illustrious promises of modernism that were made during the Industrial Revolution and before World War II, let alone after World War II. So are there any questions on this or on any of those things that I've just said?
So if you're painting flowers that you bought at the grocery store, you're not on the map.
Not necessarily. Like, think about David Hockney. He just did a big series of flowers.
Wow.
He did them on an iPad, so, I mean, that gets him right through the door right away. But he's also, because of the technology, but he's also, that wouldn't necessarily get everyone right through the door. He's researched for decades how technology has been used in painting. So he did that whole book about optics and how artists used lenses to project images and how technology has been used for hundreds of years in painting. So in using the iPad, he's doing one more thing in that thread. He's thinking about art history and is motivated and participating in art history when he's using his iPad to do these flower paintings. And there's that whole tradition of still life painting as well. So, but he's conscious of it, and his intention is to remark on and be a part of that tradition. So I think self-consciousness and intention are big parts of that. Are you on the map or off the map, to use your phrase?
Thank you. A quality of postmodernism that has always seemed to be obvious is it's almost like a bowerbird or a magpie, taking bits and pieces from past eras and juxtaposing in one relationship. So,
Absolutely. That's another thing I would say is that fragmentation is a huge feature of postmodernism and contemporary art. Fragmentation brought about by digitalization and by globalization. So we've had mass migrations of humans in the last 30 years. We have fragmentation of society so that we can't all in this room, we didn't all read all the same books in English class. We can't all kind of appeal to the same texts and norms. And you can't take it for granted that we all are working with the same toolkit when we think about literature and language. And furthermore, with this kind of death of painting that happened in the 80s, it was kind of like the idea was that painting closed and now all that's left is to quote other traditions of painting and other eras. So you would do kind of like a abstract expressionism meets minimalism, or you would do like a bit of surrealism with a little bit of conceptualism, and you would lift and pick and do a little Matisse with a little Picasso. Like you would
Do you
put
mean
these
like
together.
in one painting?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the fragmentation.
Yeah, so the
Okay.
fragmentation becomes very literal in painting, where you're actually quoting from different sources. So we'll get to that. But thank you for pointing that out, because it's not here, it's on my notes here, that fragmentation is a huge part of it. I would also say that contemporary art, now that kind of the big trend of postmodernism and working out these ideas has kind of passed and been digested, I would say that we're kind of moving towards an authenticity and democracy. So when we were working out these ideas about postmodernism, it was really heady and it was really dense writing. And now we've talked in some of Wendy's classes about this collapse where there's very little difference between a review of a show in The Guardian that might be kind of for the public, like I liked it, you'd like it, and some heavy theory where that's like an art form, where they bring out the philosophers and the theorists. those two kind of ends of the spectrum of art writing have been moving towards each other and are almost indecipherable now, which is what I mean by when I say democratic. And there's pros and cons to that. Some people hate that and some people love it because it opens things up for people, but it also means definitions have kind of lost their edge and it's kind of harder to talk about things in a serious way. For those of us who want to really, do PhDs in this stuff, right? So on to the images. This first artist, Cara Thuring, is from Brussels. She was born in 1972. And this first image is a good example of artists' interest in relationship with humans and industry and technology. Thuring is interested in heavy industry's ratios of man to landscape and the construction effort to function. That is, the enormous amount of engineering that goes into an industrial structure that performs relatively simple tasks. Thuring sees this cumbersome relationship and potential futility as inherent to the act of painting. This work, The Industrialist, which is oil on linen, and it's 183 by 244 centimeters, was developed from an image of an unfinished girdered building. The hard geometry of the architecture becomes dissembled through Thuring's loose brushstrokes, creating a space that is both technological and human. So in the modernism, you had this, say with the futurists, you had this passion for technology, and you have paintings of propellers and skyscrapers and machines. And now that we're kind of 100 years later, we're a little bit suspicious of machines in our world. They can be a bit scary. And so Thuring here is looking at machines and looking at the machine made, and she's humanizing it, and she's, instead of being excited about the precision, she's trying to kind of bring it back to this human level. Like, humans made it, humans are behind it. It's kind of ridiculous, like, that there's so much. If you've ever looked at all the engineering drawings that go into like making one solar panel, for instance, it's an incredible amount of effort for this thing that's relatively inert. So she's thinking about that when she's doing this work. Same artist, this is called General Scenes of Unloading, oil on linen, 199 by 250 centimeters. And this is a good example of the fragmentation. And fragmentation presents itself in another way in contemporary art, which is fragmentation of attention. That we don't necessarily, I personally believe that I don't have the same attention span as someone who made etchings in the Renaissance. I am not going to be able to do a building facade in fine point. I just am not. And I don't think it's an evolution thing. I think it's just kind of this, our brains are plastic, and maybe if I went on a desert island for 20 years I could regain that, but the environment I live in, and so I'm not going to try. And that's one of the things that the pessimism of postmodernism isn't necessarily a negative thing. It's kind of, sometimes it's like you're being pessimistic that I'm not going to be able to do a water study like Da Vinci did, so I'm just not going to try. It says, Thuring often works directly on linen canvas and leaves its bare surface visible in many places. This replicates the aesthetics of a draft or blueprint. For Thuring, the docklands are a complete ecosystem where each element has a function that is a part of an interdependent network. She is interested in how machinery can exist as a created personality by dint of its manufacture or function. In her painting, Thuring translates the scene intuitively. Fragments of cranes, pipes, and security barriers become isolated, and she highlights certain details while omitting others. One critic talked about how each of these separate things that she's painted, like the wrecking ball and the pulley on the arm, they're like little portraits that she's done separately. So it's this idea of kind of flitting around and zeroing in, but then you flit to another thing and you zero in on that, and you get this fragmented point of view. But it's not careless. It's a uneven distribution of care, if you will. This is called 409. It's from 2008. And it's oil and gesso and ink on linen, 244 by 335 centimeters. In this work, the black line that meanders through 409 retraces the actual flight path of a glider over the Alps. Thurin recreates this event with minimal information: a building, a mountain, an aircraft, and line. Each element is rendered independently and in disproportionate scale. This creates a heightened awareness of the flat picture plane and exposes the multiple ways we understand space as an illusion. So the rejection of illusionism, which is the idea that a painting is a window that you look through and you forget that you're looking at a painting, you're seeing the scene. That's this idea of illusionism in painting. That was rejected by the modernists at the turn of the century. That was the scandal around Impressionism. That's what the abstract expressionists threw out the window entirely when they went to pure abstraction and action painting. It's this idea that painting has to be illusionistic and kind of trick the viewer into believing that they're looking at something that's not really there. And contemporary art goes one step further, and they say we can reject illusionism and still do things that are recognizable. So in that sense, let's do the Alps, let's do a chateau and some birds, but I'm not going to try to make it convincing. So while the abstract expressionists rejected illusionism by being completely abstract, and that is non-figurative, in contemporary art now, contemporary painting now, we're going back to having some figuration, having recognizable objects, but we're not going to try and make it illusionistic. This is called Mite 1, oil on linen. And I want to introduce three concepts of painting that will help you get a handle when you're looking at abstract painting these days. And this room is a great place to start. The first concept is painterly space. Painterly space is, you think about visual space. So if there's perspective in a painting, then there's a sense of depth. So that's this objective space in a work, that it looks like you have a wall and there's a door and there's a room behind that door. So it feels like there's actual space that if you were in that painting, you could move around in it. Painterly space, or subjective space, is a room for the viewer to experience and imagine in a painting. So Albert Durer's drawing of a rabbit has very little subjective space. It delineates everything so clearly that there it is. I see it, I know what it is, I can appreciate the technique, I can imagine things about the scene, what that rabbit is doing, but it doesn't do a lot to trigger your imagination and give you room to kind of play when you're looking at the work. The other thing, and in contemporary painting, that space, while in other work, like with the symbolists, for example, they might have invited you to have an imaginative or subjective experience in a work. In the past, it was prescriptive. They had an idea of what that experience would be. But now, the idea is, the artist never isn't going to say, I want you to feel this, I want you to come to this conclusion. We've abandoned that idea of controlling the experience of the viewer. The other concept is index, and index is a mark. An index is a mark that implies something. So that could be a tool. You can see here the pyramid kind of forms, and the black that's behind them. It looks like there was a stencil used here. So while this might have been done by a brush, this line and the way this fades, it looks like more they laid something down, masked it, like they laid something down and sprayed. And so so you would say that mark is an index of that process. It's an index of spray paint, or it's an index of marking. Or when you're talking about brush strokes, you would say that a brush stroke is an index of the artist's hand. It means that the artist touched the canvas. But when you talk about an index of masking, it means that the artist was removed from the canvas. They were doing a mechanical process. They weren't kind of in there. I mean, Jackson Pollock's celebrated boot prints in his paintings are an index of him being physically present in the painting when he was working. And a related concept is facture. And facture is how the painting was made. So how is the surface treated? Did they mask it very carefully, or did they work spontaneously? Were they systematic, or were they fitful? Were they using a traditional process or an unconventional one? So index and facture are technical terms and we're talking about how the work is made. And when we look at the work, if we see that a palette knife was used, or if a brush was used, if it was house paint, or if it was graphite, and we're thinking about kind of the energy that went into it and how it was made. Were they aggressive and maybe tearing it, or were they being really, really careful with it? The next artist I want to talk about is Amy Silman. She's from Detroit. And her dealer says of her work, part of the strength of Amy Silman's paintings derives from the conscious use of awkwardness as an aspect of form. So awkwardness is this quality where some of the things we've been talking to kind of come together, where it's self-conscious, it rejects virtuosity, in the sense it's pessimistic about being able to do things illusionistically or kind of in this really detailed way. And it rejects the infallibility of the artist's eye and hand. So it's a way that, again, that pessimism isn't necessarily negative. Rather, it's that we're going to be more open-ended in the way that we make art. So, talking about facture or how work is made. This work, My Pirate, oil on canvas, 200 by 160 centimeters. This work captures the procession of thought, mirroring the meander of the subconscious. So the factor of this work is that she kind of made it up as she went along and kind of followed her whims. And the subjective space created in this work is created through its free-form approach to painting. Silman develops a painterly dimension where landscapes emerge as emotive terrains. So because it's kind of stream of consciousness and it's made in this kind of meandering way, even though there's something kind of recognizable, and she gives it a title that says, go ahead and see a pirate ship there. It's also kind of, they're also being invited to play with it and imagine, and this kind of, oh, orange, oh, pink, oh, bits of yellow, those, and entertain just whatever emotion or subjective feeling that evokes in you. This work is called Cliff No. 1 from 2005. And talking about index, the artist's index of the artist's hand, or even index of the artist's state of mind. Formless structures of line, shape, color, and shading become signifiers, pensive, blissful, menacing, or frail, each lending their qualities to almost recognizable forms. So the marks in this work are indices, which is the plural of index, indices of her states of mind. You can see some real dry brush, you can see some little flowers up in the corner where she's letting herself be as naive as she feels she'd like to be.
Jess, did you say these are oil or acrylic?
These are oil on canvas.
And most of the work we've looked at this evening so far has been oil, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Of her own work, Silman says, painting is a physical thinking process to continue an interior dialogue, a way to engage a kind of internal discourse or sublinguistic mumbling. Her dealer says, Amy Silman's composition suggests private thought that is simultaneously whimsical and brutal. This is the last one of hers. And so thinking about painterly space again, as layers of gestural brush marks record her creative process, the composition suggests an organic architecture evoking an expanse of eternalized psychological perception. Any questions on Amy Stillman?
Could you say that again?
That last quote?
sentence.
As layers of gestural brush marks record her creative process, the composition suggests an organic architecture evoking an expanse of internalized psychological perception.
How big is that piece in inches or feet?
These have all been 1 meter to 1.5 meters kind of square.
Did you choose these artists because they resonated with you personally, or along with certain things you think?
It's a handful, yeah. It's like some of them because they resonate with me. This one for sure resonates with me, and others because they kind of these three concepts emerge, and some of them just really illustrate those concepts really well.
Would you label this modernist or postmodern?
No, this is contemporary. Yeah. Contemporary contains modernism. I didn't say that. When we talk about going from modernism to postmodernism, we don't throw modernism out. We take those lessons and run with them. But there are some things that we might say, you know what, that doesn't work for us anymore. We're going to do it a different way. But it's not anti-modernist. So this is Charlene von Heil. She's German. She has a huge show at the Tate. It opened in October. And in their catalog, the Tate says that von Heil is at the forefront of a new generation of abstract painters who have rejected late modernism's emphasis on a singular signature style. So she makes process-based work using masking, cloning, layering, mutating, and she filters recycled images. So I get the impression reading about her work that she actually just has a few images, like from art history, that she's morphed and changed and filtered and layered and uses over and over again in her work. The catalog, these are all acrylic, oil, and charcoal on canvas, and they're about 2 meters square. The catalog goes on to say, the painterly space she creates is not illusionistic in a perspectival sense. Neither it is the literal material surface of the canvas. Instead, it is a fusing of paint, pattern, color, and imagery that almost hovers in front of the canvas, materializing as if it had been digitally generated, even corrupted like a digital file. This relationship to the digital is worth reflecting upon, because von Heil is very much a studio-based practitioner who doesn't use computers in the making of her paintings. Nonetheless, the spatial layering is akin to looking at multiple windows on a computer screen. This new visual field would have been impossible before the age of technological mediation. So what the curator is saying here is that she's not using computers to make her work, but making work like this would have been impossible before computers, because it's given her a whole different visual language to work with. New things have become salient to our eyes since computers have come into the world. She says of her work that she searches for a new image that stands for itself as a fact. So she's not talking about illusionism, but she's talking about making things that seem real. So it's not something that is actually in the world, but she wants to make something that is somehow so coherent and has so much kind of inner logic that it has its own life, that we believe it exists as we see it. She says, good paintings leave a hole in the mind. So I'm moving more quickly now because I see how much time I spent on the first artist. But please tell me if you'd like me to stop, slow down, or go back. Ryan Sullivan is a young artist, younger than me, from New York City. And he's all about facture. He's all about how a work is made. What he does is he ignores warnings about don't use acrylic with oil, don't use enamel with this or that. And he dumps the materials together, lets it dry just enough on a flat canvas or a flat surface anyways, and then tilts it. And it starts to congeal and slide. Zane, I think of your work a little bit, where some of your works where you really scrape that paint up and sand it and scrape it and sand it. So his work, if we think about modernism again, Clement Greenberg, who was kind of a spokesperson for modernism, talked about the flatness of painting. That flatness is the true nature of paint, and we need to not ignore that. We need to highlight that and be honest with ourselves. And so then we need to talk about the surface of a painting, not about what it's representing. Well, here Sullivan's work is not flat. This is a leathery, crinkled skin. This is 3-4 inches thick, deep. So he's eliminated flatness, and he's just all about surface. You can see on the left-hand side there's nothing there. That's actually a bite out of the canvas. That's not gesso or white canvas underneath. That's wall. So he's not completely. He's not worried about working within this window of a rectangle.
So he's only like 30?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So they call his process alchemical. And he talks about how he doesn't want to know or be able to control these processes. He says that not knowing what's going to happen is what keeps him going into the studio the next day. And these again are about 1.5 meters by 1 meter. The shifting paint strengthens the concept of painting as a temporary entity, reminding us that painting symbolizes both a process and a result. So process painting is another kind of feature in contemporary art, is that we're thinking about how it was made, and the artist is actually most interested and engaged in a process. They're not worried about the result. They're not, again, trying to be prescriptive and have this scene that evokes this emotion or idea in people. They're just really caught up in the materials. He says of his work, "Seeing how things change as they dry keeps me coming in every morning. I wouldn't want to learn how to control that. It's really important to let a painting take on its own direction." And it can give you the impression that postmodernism and these ideas started in the 80s. Postmodernism and this idea of critiquing modernism goes all the way back, I think, in art, at least to the Dadaists. It goes all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution didn't kind of come across as roses to everyone. Like, there were problems that were obvious then. And if you think about the Dadaists, the chance was what they celebrated in work. And so this is just more chance. 100 years later, people have started to really catch on to why chance is important in art. Ryan Sullivan mitigates gesture and authorship through an entropic apparatus. So again, this idea, so chance or entropy, this like kind of natural decay of things, those are directly opposed to this idea of the artist being this hero that's creating something out of nothing. And this is what they look like in a show.
Yeah, but the works are quite large. That's Baroque in itself.
It is. Yeah.
And also being able to be independent from a movement, to just concentrate on what they're interested in, that's also a characteristic of heroism.
That's interesting. So she said that being independent of a movement, to just be free to do what he wants, is a heroic thing in and of itself.
Jessica, those paintings need each other, don't they? They're beautiful. That's a beautiful display.
Mm-hmm.
And they suddenly make far more sense to me, personally, together.
That's really interesting, Florence. We're going to talk about that, I think, on the next artist. But yeah, I often think these remind me of Edward Bertinsky's photographs as well.
Yes, yes.
There's something which I've always just personally been interested in, that the kind of microcosm and macrocosm start to resemble each other. That just this close, like one thin skin of paint can resemble, you know, a satellite photograph of the ocean. We'll get to the relationality of paintings on the next artist, Florence. So this is Ian Davenport, born 1966, from the UK. He's a young British artist who first exhibited in Damien Hirst's Frieze show. So that's the show that Damien Hirst pulled together himself and kind of got the Saatchi brothers involved in and launched the young British artists. And these are acrylic paint on aluminum. And they're this one is 71 by 52 centimeters. These paintings are made using a syringe to pour the paint in vertical stripes from the top edge to the floor. The painting process is formal and repetitive, like a scientific experiment, but the final image contains irregularities, where the paint is diverted by the wall surface, and surprises, where particular color combinations create unexpected visual results. This is called puddle painting, dark gray, after Uccello. So Paolo Uccello was a Renaissance painter. He's known for his frescoes. This is acrylic on aluminum, and what he's done is he's taken the palette that Uccello used and then done his syringe process. So this is another way of rifling through history. This is puddle painting turquoise after Bonnard, so that would be Pierre Bonnard from the Impressionist, Post-Impressionists. And this one is a meter, 123 centimeters by 98 centimeters. This one just, you can see what they're talking about when they talk about accidents and color combinations, that it's just, even though it's backlit, well, the way we're looking at it is electronic, and it still causes this thing on your eye where it's kind of hard to look at. And one of the things is that makes sense to us because we look at electronic images all the time, and that we look at backlit digital images, and so this has got a contemporary feel just in its color palette and in the effect it has on our eye. And this is what they look like when they're installed. This is at the University of Warwick in their Institute of Mathematics and Statistics.
So would you just paint right on the wall in that case?
I think so, yes.
Thank you for the context picture.
Yeah. So this artist, Matt Connors, is from Chicago, and this gets to what Florence was talking about interrelationality, this idea that paintings work together. Frieze magazine reviewed this show, and they said of it, Connors demonstrates what color can do, how it can affect boundaries or lines with its physical properties, or produce optical effects as seen in the chromatic shadows that bounce off his paintings. So in other words, this is a poor photograph because you can see the reflection of this blue rod in the floor. They should have included that whole reflection on the floor to have a proper photograph of this work, because he's thinking about these things. He's thinking about the shadow that rod is creating on that cream canvas or backdrop. He's also thinking about how these two pieces relate to one another. And I would suspect that this isn't a flat piece, that this probably comes out and there's red painted on the back that's reflecting to create this red glow. The physical physical conditions of his art speak to its relationality. Light washes of color result in fuzzy boundaries. Hues bleed into one another where forms make contact. So if you look at the scale of this, these are hung at about eye height, and maybe at arms, there may be a meter wide, a meter square. And so if you walked up to see this, your peripheral vision would be encompassed by these works. And so this is an installation more than just 4 paintings or six paintings. So we talk about, this would be another theme or value in contemporary art, is interrelationality or relationality, that we need each other to make sense of things. We need each other to get through it. We can't just be this heroic individual that goes their own. We can be, but we won't get as far. The curator for this show says, Connors also tends to work in a site-specific manner with painted floors, leaning walls, and other sculptural elements, reminding us that what lies outside a painting's frame always conditions our perception of the medium. So context is really important. You can't take his work and do a traveling exhibit and just kind of throw it on the wall from place to place. The context is going to change things, and that again is a feature of postmodernism, where there used to be this grand theory since the Enlightenment that we could figure out the source of religion and language, and psychoanalysis, that we can kind of get to the core of what really makes people tick. And postmodernism rejected those ideas and said, you can't take like the same seed. We didn't all grow from the same seed. We're all shaped by our environment. Maybe almost exclusively we're shaped by our environment. This is acrylic colored pencil on canvas and acrylic on wood. So this is called Green Ratio plus Red Angle from 2011. So again, this back part he'd be really interested in this. And there's a tiny bit of reflection on the wall that you can see there. So this is formal abstraction. This isn't too much new from conceptualism and painting about painting. So in this sense, contemporary art doesn't reject modernism.
Jess, is this a painting or a sculpture?
Well, they're shown as paintings. He calls them paintings. Yeah.
But he's interested in more than just one side of it, isn't he?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm kind of like resisting going down that road. Is it painting or sculpture? I think, but absolutely, it is sculptural.
Yeah.
And it can be both. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because if you put it in the middle of then it would be something else.
And that's a great point. He didn't put it in the middle of the room. So that's his way of asserting it is painting. He's still standing on something when he says it's a painting, not a sculpture.
Okay, cool.
This is called My Suitor, acrylic on canvas. And these are 170 by 260 centimeters. So it looks really washed out. This is a canvas that's the same size. It's white. So this really exemplifies the idea of interrelationality. I mean, it's almost a cutesy cartoon of it in painting. Moving along and going further into how formal abstraction is not dead, we come to Edel Adnan. She's born 1925. She's from Beirut, and she was trained and studied in San Francisco. She showed at the most recent Documenta, and so I say again, there's still room for modernist principles in contemporary art. This mountain here is a mountain that is outside of her studio in Marin County, and she talks about that, and she's painted it over and over again. These are small, they're 24 by 30 centimeters, and when they showed her work at Documenta, there was like 30 of them just at eye level. And she talks about this mountain having the same relationship with this mountain as Cézanne did with Mount Victoire, or Hokusai did with Mount Fuji, where it's just, you keep painting it, you want to know it, you want to know it. She says, colors exist for me as entities in themselves, as metaphysical beings, like the attributes of God exist as metaphysical entities. So these are all oil on canvas. She says, when I die, the universe will have lost its best friend, someone who loved it with a passion. So she just loves the landscape, and she just has committed to it. This is untitled bracket 192 from 2013. The last one was untitled bracket 217 from 2013. So 217 would indicate that this is the 217th one in this series. This is another kind of body of work that she's done, and these are called readings, and they're classical Arabic poetry that she has written in her own handwriting. So if you know anything a little bit about classical Arabic, is that it can take a lifetime to learn how to write Arabic properly. It can become its own discipline to write Arabic. And so there are classical poems that are written in perfect calligraphy that actually embody the meaning of the poetry. So the look of the handwriting is synonymous and one with the meaning of the poem. And so what she's done is she's taken these classical poems and written them without regard for the calligraphic tradition. And in doing so, she calls them readings, because instead of kind of going to a cafe and hearing someone read aloud, you see how she's read the work. Reviewer said of her work, it should also be said that Adnan's paintings are austere, almost severe. There's no facile attempt, no adornment, no concession to the viewer. A simple statement about a proposed moment. So this is, again, this idea that she's not giving the viewer too much to work with, because she's not trying to foist the viewer into any one perspective or idea. In her book, Thinking About Painting from 2012, German art critic Isabel Brug suggested reinterpreting the index in the context of painting. So she says, here the index would not be understood as a sign physically connected with that which it represents, but as a genuine painterly mark that creates a suggestion of the absent artist's presence. The implied presence of the artist would be the actual painterly effect, and it is this effect that makes painting so alluring, so charged, and so problematic even today. It also explains, Ra continues, why we in the art world like to talk about a Richter rather than a painting by Gerhard Richter, as if we were speaking of a quasi-subject that has been affected by the artist. So this is expanding on this idea of index, this index represents the presence of the artist, or even actually more correctly represents the absence of the artist, because we get a taste of who the artist is and feel that they are not there, they're represented by their painting. And that's such a strong feeling that we equate the painting with the person. So they mentioned Richter, and I couldn't talk about contemporary abstraction without talking about Gerhard Richter. So Gerhard Richter is from Dresden. He was born in 1932, and he grew up and was trained in East Germany. So he was trained in the discipline of socialist realism. And he made, for decades, he painted from photographs, from news photographs. And I like this idea of, it's a really great way of talking about subjective space, because when you think about a news photograph has to be, we believe it's true. Like a news photograph is a document of something that happened somewhere else, and we have to trust It's based on this idea of trusting that that's really what happened. And Richter, so it's the place where there'd be the least amount of subjective space. Like, it's a document. And Richter manages to create subjective space in these documentary photographs. So this painting is called September, and you might recognize the Twin Towers before they fell. This is from his red, blue, yellow series. He did hundreds of these. It's oil on canvas. They're 26 by 53 centimeters. And let's talk about index. This is an index of a brush. This is an index of oil paint. Richter says, experience has proved that there is no difference between a so-called realist painting of a landscape, for example, and an abstract painting. They both have more or less the same effect on the observer. This is more recent from 2007. Oil and acrylic, 80 by 96 centimeters. Richter says, painting is the making of an analogy for something non-visual and incomprehensible, giving it form and bringing it within reach. And that is why good paintings are incomprehensible. Creating the incomprehensible has absolutely nothing to do with turning out any old bunkum, because bunkum is always comprehensible. You might recognize this as from the body of work he was creating in the movie about him that came out recently. And you have to ask the question, how could painting get to this point where it's white? Like if you saw the film, he uses a pretty primary set of colors, and he smears and smears, and he has this big, like a squeegee, but it's like man-sized, and he drags it across, and you can see, I remember someone commenting, it's like, you watch him make this beautiful painting, and then he covers it up. Like, and so how could you get to this point? He says, I think everybody starts out by seeing a few works of art and wanting to do something like them. You want to understand what you see, what is there, and you try to make a picture out of it. Later, you realize that you can't represent reality at all. That what you make represents nothing but itself, and therefore is itself reality. So he's representing this painting. He's making this painting. He's not trying to represent anything. He's trying to show you what paint does when you use this tool.
When Gerhard Richter uses the tool.
That's right. Yeah. This is his most recent work. He calls these works behind glass, and they're actually enamel poured onto glass and then shown backwards. So you're looking at glass, and then the enamel is stuck on the other side. So these are paintings about paint that are free from even the constraints of canvas. This is, I think, pretty as close as anyone's gotten to doing a work that's really just about paint. It's not even about paint on canvas or paint applied with a brush on canvas. This is just, it's like making a microscopic slide when you put it on the glass.
What size are those?
These are 24 by 30 centimeters.
And so does he just pour the paint on, or is he using brushes as well?
I don't know a whole lot about his process, you know.
Yeah. It's so interesting, because in some parts it looks like he just poured on the paint, but in other parts it's just way too many details for it to be.
Yeah, he could be dragging, implements through, or tilting it, or mixing it.
Jessica, I wonder what he'd feel if you said, I don't want to look at it on the glass side, I'm going to turn it around and hang it on my wall the other way round.
I don't know either. I don't know if it would look the same. Like these look like slices, like they would be the same all the way through, but they might not be. It would ruin the pun, though, of a work behind glass.
Right.
So these two, I want to show you this one. and this one, and talk about this term that Richter coined in 1963, and it's capitalist realism. And he coined it in opposition to socialist realism. So socialist realism was the approved art of the Communist Party in the Eastern Bloc and in the USSR, and it was, you know, this kind of heroic, we're going to show the workers and we're going to show what socialism really looks like. And capitalist realism, he coined this term when he had a show in a furniture shop. And I think part of the idea there is that when you have an art show in a furniture shop, you're talking about the commodity, art is commodity, that you get a painting that matches the couch, that when you redecorate your house, you need to get a whole new gallery of paintings. And so he's always done a lot of work where it's like he's churning them out. He's making, if you go to his website, there are thousands of paintings. So people have picked up on this idea of capitalist realism, and Mark Fisher is one of its more formal theorists now. And he talks about it as the inescapability of neoliberalism in the market, that everything now is related to neoliberalism and related to the power of the market, that we can't escape it. Everything is understood and happens on those terms, and everything is co-opted by it. Fisher says, the ideology at least purports not only to not want to invade on one's inner space, so that's the liberalism part, that we're not going to intrude on your rights, but it often claims that by allowing a certain degree of freedom and idiosyncrasy, the system as a whole can become stronger. So that's the market. The competition is better than monopoly. After all, the heroes of capitalist realism, unlike the heroes of socialist realism, are the rogues, the mavericks, the outliers, and the individuals. So when we talk about Ryan Sullivan being heroic and kind of going his own way, he's heroic in the sense of, like, Steve Jobs was heroic because he went his own way, you know, or Mark Zuckerberg was heroic, but it's all within this kind of ever-enlarging bubble of the market, that everything can be co-opted and brought back into the fold and made money off of. And so Richter's work is playing with this. He's kind of unabashedly churning out work, but he's also maybe making a clown of it. Like, he's challenging it, like, how far can I go? Like, I've got my name is worth a lot of money. What happens if I make 2,000 paintings though, like, of the same thing? So there's one last one, just to, they look really geological.
Yeah.
So Pia Fries was, this is the second to last artist. I know it's going a bit longer than. Pia Fries was a student under Richter, and she teaches in Berlin now. So again, talking about index and the mark of the artist as it relates to authorship and temperament. Pia Fries makes these works with silkscreen and oil, and they're on wood panel. The New York Times, and this one is about 100 by 145 centimeters. The New York Times said of her work, "Facture is one of those $10 art words you encounter after mastering terms like composition, hue, and value. It refers to the process of making, and more specifically, the handling of a painting surface." So they're talking about, look how much this looks like frosting. Mm-hmm. And it's contrasted with how flat the screen print of these books are. Fat ribbons and pools of diluted oil paint and globs of pigment the size of softballs are laid down next to the faux painted elements. Big, generous brushstrokes Mrs. Fries has photographed and silkscreened onto the canvas. So some of these...
The faux painting is sitting right on the surface, right on the picture plane, and the blobs are sitting in front of the picture plane.
That's right.
And the illusion is behind the picture plane, the linear perspective. They're quite the paintings.
Yeah, so some of these these what look like icing and thick brush strokes, are actually silk screened on. So, unless you were there in the flesh looking at them, even then, you may not be able to tell what she's applied and what is a photographic rendering.
So she's silk screening the drop shadows and everything on as well, right?
I'm
To make
not
them
sure.
look three-dimensional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of these, she's also bolting pieces of metal right onto the canvas as well. So I wanted to, last time I didn't have this and I kept referring to it. This is Roy Lichtenstein from 1965, and this is a silk screen of a brushstroke. So he's referring back to the abstract expressionists when there are these films of de Kooning and Pollock making their paintings, and like the vigorous virility of the brushstroke was heavily celebrated. And so he says, here's a brushstroke, I silk screened it. So this is the epitome of irony. Irony, again, it's a slippery definition sometimes, is the expression of one's meaning by using language that normally signifies the opposite, typically for humorous or emphatic effect. But Fries, so Lichtenstein was being ironic. Fries, and again, and Lichtenstein was a pop artist, and I would say he kind of is a proto-contemporary artist. He's not since the 80s, but he fits this kind of model of criticizing modernism and breaking away from the heroic individual. Fries now is, this is beautiful. She's not just being ironic. She doesn't have to walk around with her tongue in cheek. So this is kind of what I was talking about when I was saying there's a turn now to authenticity. This idea that we can make things just because we like them. We can make them because we love how they look. But she's doing this with reference and eyes wide open to the history of art and where she's coming from. This is how they look installed. I was surprised how big that one was. And this is one where this is an iron. This is an iron plate that's bolted right onto the wood. In the first image, there was a stack of books that you could see had said butterflies and insects. And you can see here, there's this texture that's evocative of a scientific drawing or a botanical. And she actually uses in her silk screen also the work of Maria Sibylla Merian, who is a German naturalist and illustrator from the 1700s. And so Merian did like these beautiful botanical prints and etchings that you might recognize as kind of the scientific drawings of that era. It would be similar to Audubon. And it's the New York Times, in their review of this show, couldn't make sense of why that was there in this work. They were kind of like, that's just too personal, or kind of, why is it in there? And I would say I would say that makes sense. I would say that, not in the New York Times makes sense, but her inclusion, I can make sense of that. Because she's harking back to this other type of art that didn't make it into the category of fine arts. But to think about a woman in the 1700s doing scientific drawings is already a bit unorthodox and unconventional. And then to talk about flowers and a woman painting flowers, that could be considered really domestic and decorative in the most derogatory sense. But they're scientific, and they've stood the test of time. And Fries is harking back to them and quoting them to say, these have value. I'm going to do stuff that is beautiful and also has authority, just like Maria did. So what I'm trying to say is that beauty and authority aren't mutually exclusive. And that might be what Sibylla Merian's work represents in Fries' work. And this is 100 by 145. The titles are kind of those boring titles. This is called Bolted Plate. Oil and silkscreen on wood and copper.
And Jess, is that an irregular edge we're seeing Or is
No, they're
is it a
rectangular.
rectangle?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can see again this kind of this etching image from an old botanical. This last artist, Rebecca Morris, born in 1969 in Honolulu. She teaches at the Pasadena College of Art. And I chose to end on with her when I was presenting to Zane's class because she had a retrospective at the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago, which is a contemporary art museum there that's been around since 1919, I think. So there's a brain bender, contemporary art since 1919. And there's this really great essay that accompanied that show, and it's a direct challenge to anyone who is trying to be an abstract painter or is an abstract painter today. So she coined the term perverse formalism in her personal manifesto for abstractionists and friends of the non-objective. And a quote from that manifesto would be, "Make work that is so secret, so fantastic, so dramatically old school / new school, that it looks like it was found in a shed, locked up since the 1940s. So similar to Ryan Sullivan's work, facture is determined by gravity and the drying properties of oil, which contracts and congeals, forming a skin that seems to emerge from within the paintings. With a life of their own, the paintings become susceptible to disease and aging, forms of corruption well beyond any irony. I'm going to start reading from the essay, and it's by Hamza Walker. Rebecca Morris's commitment to abstraction is a prerequisite for coping with a pluralism arising not only from across disciplines, but from within the discipline of painting itself. Abstraction is now a given, an option that is taken for granted as one chooses rather than fights to become an abstract painter. So the first idea is that abstraction, originally people had to fight. People rioted at their shows, they had to justify the idea of being an abstract painter. Now, you come to Visa, you get to take abstract painting. Like, you get to just choose to be an abstract painter, like you would choose to paint a horse or some flowers. So we take it for granted. It is a choice, however, within a discipline that has become a field of specialization by virtue of taking on the characteristics of a language. So that brushstroke, the Liechtenstein brushstroke that's now being silkscreened onto frieze, this idea of this expressive impasto brushstroke, that is a signifier of abstract expressionism. That means that. If the closure of modernist painting is taken as the closure of painting itself, then under the aegis of postmodernism, painting's history is a finite collection of styles readily offering itself up for quotation. In other words, paintings are read in and through reference to other paintings, begging the question, once abstraction has acquired legibility, is there such a thing as an abstract painting? For painters who share Morris's commitment to abstraction, the challenge is to reinvent on terms that are relevant and relative to the spirit and conditions that make abstract painting urgent and necessary. For the better part of the 20th century, this struggle was defined by the dialectical tension between abstraction and figuration. In Morris's case, the struggle is defined by an irony residing exclusively within the domain of abstract painting. In short, abstract painting has nothing to overcome but itself. So those are my closing thoughts. I'll let Hamza Walker share closing thoughts on that. That abstraction, contemporary abstraction, is a bit of a paradox, because abstraction, you can study all the movements of abstraction in the 20th century now, and doing a work of abstraction now can be dissected to be, here's a bit of that, here's a bit of that. So is it really abstract? So thank you so much for coming. you so much that you're kind of dazed and unable to enjoy a glass of wine and chat with your table mates.